Hello and welcome to this very special session hosted by TTS, which we're calling Little Lockdowners, Can We Change the Long-Term Impact of the Pandemic on Young Minds? My name is Alistair Bryce-Clegg. I'm an early years specialist and I help teachers and parents in early years settings. I work in the UK and internationally, supporting local authorities and practitioners to ensure the best outcomes for the children in their care. Now, as you all know, in March 2020, our entire world changed when COVID-19 placed probably the biggest threat on mankind in generations, and every single family across the globe had to recalibrate in unprecedented ways. So we had parents who were beginning to juggle homeschooling with staying at work, and also teachers and early years practitioners who were battling with literally overnight changes to policy and government rules, which affected their day-to-day practice. So families were experiencing financial and emotional stress, and social distancing meant that we could only socialize with certain people in our bubble. Now, for some families, the pandemic brought some new opportunities and positives, but for others, the reality was very different. And now here we are, just over 2 years later, with a cohort of young children and babies whose experiences of life are very different to those that have gone before them. Over the next few years, there's no doubt that as educational practitioners, we are going to be facing unknown challenges in how to support these children, while the education system also is playing catch up at the same time. So today, we're going to have a discussion where we're going to think about what we might be seeing as these children enter our settings. We're going to be asking the question, have young people been impacted by the pandemic? And if they have, what can we do about it? And also, what should we be looking out for on a day-to-day basis? But most of all, we want to try and get to what we can do literally tomorrow that might create an environment for these children to thrive in, not just to survive in. And I'm really excited to say that joining me to talk about these things, we've got 4 esteemed industry experts who are going to be bringing their experience and their understanding and also any initial data that is coming to light to help us to have a strategy around what we can do. So please welcome early childhood educator and New York Times best-selling author, Erica Christakis. Erica's book, The Importance of Being Little, What Young Children Really Need from Grown-Ups, was literally a groundbreaking insight into what it's like to be a young child in America today, especially in a world that's designed by and for adults. And Erica's current focus is early detection of reading difficulties and how that intersects with poverty, trauma, and fissures within family relationships. Hello, Erica.
Hello, great to be here.
We're also joined by Professor David Daly, who's got a very long title, which I will hopefully get right, and I'm sure David will tell me if I don't. But David is Professor of Psychological Intervention and Behaviour Change at Nottingham University. And what that basically means is that David specializes in the treatment of neurodevelopmental disorders in young children, and he has some fascinating insights into self-regulation in children and also the concept of school readiness. Did I get that right, David?
You did, Alistair. Hello.
We're also going to hear from world-renowned resilience expert, Dr. Michael Ungar. So Michael is the founder and director of the Resilience Research Centre at Dalhousie University in Canada. And Dr. Ungar is both a family therapist and an internationally renowned researcher in the field of social and psychological resilience. So Michael's published 17 books on resilience, and several of them have been bestsellers, along with over 200 scientific papers. Hello, Michael. Great to have you with us.
Hi, Alistair. Wonderful to be here.
And lastly, we're joined by Dr. Suzanne Zidijk. Suzanne is a global research scientist and infant development specialist who is particularly fascinated by babies' innate capacity to connect. Dr. Zidijk believes that everyone deserves to share in scientists' discoveries about the world and the importance of relationships. And she founded the Connected Baby organization to bring the science of human connection to a much wider audience. Hello, Suzanne. It's lovely to have you with us.
It's delightful to be here, Alistair. Hello.
And well, hello, panel. It is really great to have you all here and be able to share that knowledge. So I want to start by thinking around the idea that what we're basically saying is that the pandemic is potentially going to have long-term effects on children's development. And that can be quite a gloomy picture for parents and practitioners to get their head around. But Suzanne, I'd be really interested in your thoughts about, the gravitas of that message and what it really means to the kind of early childhood community?
Alistair, I do think it can be scary because we human beings are an interesting group. We often want positive messages, especially about our children. And yet, what we know from the science is that if you don't have support from relationships, then that changes the way your brain, your body, your stress system develops. And our children, many of them, have had a stressful time during the pandemic. So if we are courageous enough to think about some things that might feel a bit tough, then we can actually step in to give our children what they need, which is what I think most adults want to do. We just often don't think about the knowledge, what that can feel like sometimes. So I think today is a great opportunity to think about the feeling as well as what we know.
I think some of that feeling for parents particularly is one of anxiety, because from parents who've had children pre-pandemic, there'd be lots of network support that you'd be taking your children potentially out to kind of, preschool groups, toddler groups. There'd be lots of social interactions where children would be getting a different kind of social experience to the one that been having through the pandemic. When yes, as we've said, there were some really positives for some children around those really strong connections they could make with their key family members. But actually what they haven't got is often that peer connection and being one of a group of peers as opposed to being a one-on-one with adults. So what we were used to as practitioners in terms of children who were coming into our space, the experience that they'd had outside of that space is going to be very different. Has anybody got any thoughts or advice around how then as settings we can prepare for that?
I think one of the things we have to remember is that relationships are the fuel for learning. And particularly when it comes to language development, I think there's a lot of evidence that when loving caregivers interact with children in a sort of emotionally and I would say cognitively attuned manner, and that doesn't have to be a sophisticated thing. It can be a very loving sort of back and forth, playful kind of interaction. Some specialists call it the serve and return style of communication or the conversational duet. That kind of attunement with a child does build neurons in the brain. And so I think one thing we have to remember is that even children who've been missing those really important peer relationships, I think if we can empower parents and other caregivers to understand that they do play a really important role in social and emotional and language and other forms of development. But I think if we can sort of emphasize the power that we do have over our children's development, even if we don't have degrees after our name or educational training.
I would agree entirely with what Erica has said. And I think both parents and practitioners probably don't realize just how profound peer relationships influence children's developmental skills. And I think a wonderful example of that is turn taking. Children mostly learn turn taking from interacting with other children. And when they don't get it right, those other children react quite negatively to them. And the child learns the importance of taking turns and waiting their turn. And so in the absence of very low levels of peer relationships, both during lockdown and less access to children post-lockdown, as parents perhaps make other choices about limiting children's access to friends to try and avoid reinfection, children aren't going to learn that much about turn taking. And so they will be heading into school not fully understanding how to wait their turn and take their turn. And that will have a dramatic impact on play and on friendship.
If I could also build off of what David and Erica are sort of saying here is, when you look at patterns of resilience, we do also know that families can also be great substitutes for that. In a really, really concrete way. When I'm thinking about when I'm watching a child being driven to a location in the backseat of a car, for instance, and certainly in my culture, that is a very common experience. And yet I'll see a parent give a child, especially a young child, a screen, an iPad or something like this. This is becoming increasingly common in more developed countries. And yet there is that teachable moment about we're so focused on getting kids to learn self-regulation skills and everything else. And yet in that very moment of handing the child the iPad in the back seat versus letting them sit there and listen to the two adults in the front seats actually converse and learning how to interject into a conversation. I guess what I'm saying is, as much as our children have been this deficit of the pandemic, there's also been lots of sort of just generic opportunities swarming around them in their family systems that might be able to compensate if we actually, as their caregivers, look for those opportunities.
So what I'm kind of taking from that is twofold. One is that all of these things that we're talking about aren't just a symptom of the pandemic. So all of the things in terms of things like turn taking, language interaction, serve and return were pre-pandemic development aspects for children. So hopefully practitioners will be really aware of those and have built them into their everyday practice. What I'm kind of hearing is, though, that we might need to be aware that as children haven't had as much experience of that, we need to build more of that into our everyday practice. And also around things like resilience and self-regulation, that if children haven't had a lot of opportunity to be able to build those skills, that also needs to be part of the kind of day-to-day stuff that we're doing in our settings. So creating more space to allow that kind of play and interaction to happen, which might be different from the kind of usual familiar routines that children might experience on point of entry to somewhere new.
So Alistair, if we put it this way, if the world changed, then our children changed. In other words, if our children's world changed enough, then our children changed because they had different biological experiences in relation to a different world. And it would be really easy for us grown-ups to think, right, the pandemic is over now, we can go back to the way it was. If our children have changed, then they have changed. And we need to be really curious about that and get curious about what skills are they bringing now, what behaviors are they bringing now, so that we can shift with them. Because one of the possible outcomes, if their capacity for resilience has shifted or their turn taking has shifted, then their behavior may look to us like things that we think of as bad behavior, and we can step into punishing them because we think that they're being bad, when really what's happened is that underneath their biology has changed and their capacities has changed. So I think we need to be really curious about how the world has changed and the implications of that.
I think that's a great framework. And I actually would like to add on that a little bit, which is I think even pre-pandemic, we had work to do in that regard. I think a lot of practitioners feel trapped in a system where they don't have a lot of flexibility to respond to the influences in children's lives. I know when I was an early years teacher, I sometimes felt that because it was October, I had to do a unit on pumpkins. And meanwhile, someone in my class might be experiencing trauma or the birth of a new child. And, there was this sort of persnickety kind of adult, somewhat irregular, irrational imposition of curricular ideas and notions and myths and all of this sort of baggage that we surround children in. I'm not really saying that very well, but anyway, I guess my point is just, Suzanne, thank you for framing that way. And I think we had work to do before the pandemic in really being curious about how children think and what's important to them.
What I would agree with that is that a lot of cultures around education in society are very structured around a curriculum, and that curriculum has been set often outside of a path of child development. So often curriculums are linked to outcomes or government strategies and not always linked to that kind of root of child development. And if we can, as practitioners, start to give ourselves permission, and the pandemic can be positive in that respect, that it gives us an opportunity to take a breath and think, well, what I need to do is really focus down onto these children and meet them where they are. Because there is a lot of talk globally on a catch-up culture post-pandemic, and how even our very youngest children are going to need to catch up. But catch up to what is kind of that mythical statement of what a typical child should be doing, when we all know that actually typical children don't really exist, just individual children. So I think, Erica, you talk about that in your writing, in your book, about the fact that, are we giving children what they really need, or do we, as well-meaning adults and parents, actually give children what we think we need, and sometimes we might be missing the mark?
Yes, I think that's right. I mean, I sometimes refer to what I call the Goldilocks problem, which is that we sort of miss the mark in terms of understanding children. Often we overestimate their capacity to handle taxing schedules and being overprogrammed, and we overestimate their capacity to cope with sort of everyday things like putting on a winter snowsuit if you live in a cold climate, things like that. But we also, in my opinion, grossly underestimate children's cognitive capacity, their curiosity, their thoughts, their ability to articulate what's important to them. And so it's sort of this mismatch, which I think in the child development world, someone called Vygotsky had a whole notion about this, that you sort of want to find the sweet spot for development where you're really targeting exactly where a child is and where they can learn. And I think that is, sort of a problem. Again, it predates the pandemic, and now is an opportunity to really look at it. What are we responding to our own ideas, or are we actually looking at children and the rhythms of childhood and what is easy for them, what is hard for them, what is interesting for them? And I'll just say one more quick thing. This needn't be in opposition to adult lives and behaviors. I think that's a little bit of a myth. It takes work, but it doesn't need to be a trade-off between doing what's right for children and what's right for adults.
I think, yeah, it's interesting you mentioned the rhythms of childhood, because often in early childhood education, we can talk about the rhythm of a day. So the fact that the day for a child of that age has got a rhythm to it, but that rhythm is very much hopefully dictated by the child and the child's needs. So there are things that children will learn through instruction, but I think there's also a lot that we know our children learn through experience and play. And so in terms of things like building their resilience, Michael, and also that kind of self-regulation, David, is it opportunities to play that will bring those features for children in a way that they're going to be able to understand and relate to better, do you think, rather than the idea of bringing children into more formal instruction?
I think a lot of the solutions are going to be play-based. And I think Erica's absolutely right when she was talking about, Vygotsky's ideal of how to enhance cognitive development, because that's all about scaffolding. And the key thing about scaffolding is helping parents to become observant about what their child's true level of ability is. Unfortunately, there are lots of parents who think my child is 5, this toy says 5+, therefore my child will enjoy and be able to play this toy. And then they give the child the toy and they've forgotten to think that actually their child's not got a lot of gross and fine motor coordination. So they're not actually able to even set up the toy. It's too hard for them. They don't understand how to play it. And so we want to help parents to become more observant, to choose toys that their children are going to enjoy and learn from, to play with them in ways that facilitates their learning and development. And that also builds on Michael's previous point about those teachable moments, because the more parents become understanding about their child's level of ability, then the more they will naturally engage in teachable moments. Much and all as it used to drive me mad when my children were very young, I loved their 1,000 questions a day, because you enter their world and you think there's so much going on in your mind. Yes, I don't know, I can't remember why the sky is blue. I'll have to Google it, but what a great question. And answering those questions and being patient and observant of those questions is a fantastic way to help support children and help them learn through their world.
I think what we're really talking about also is, getting expectations correct. And there's always a cultural element to this. I work on a global scale with, families all over the world. And, what is the right behavior for a child? What is expected of a child in terms of their capacity to, use a knife, to do adult-like activities, to care for a younger sibling, or what's expected in terms of developmental milestones and when they leave the lap, and all these kinds of other things are so sort of contextual that I think we really do need that curiosity as adults. But if I might, I'm also a bit concerned that as we come out of this pandemic, we're going to be part of the problem is going to be us as adults. We're anxious now about our kids. We've taught them that the world is a dangerous, dirty, germ-infested, virus-filled kind of place. And what I'm not hearing a lot from government policies anywhere that I'm traveling is an asserted effort to undo the messages that we just gave our kids about the pandemic. And so are we going to encourage kids to go out onto the playground and really start touching? Are we going to encourage them to, I keep jokingly saying, drop their sandwiches on the ground and then pick them up and eat them, because really it's actually quite safe, and that you don't have to sanitize your hands except when you come out of the toilet. And, are we going to are we going to, in a sense, encourage children back into a normative world? And I think that's going to take some work on our part to create that sense of safety and security and predictability in a world that I think they've interpreted as somewhat dangerous.
Here's one of the reasons we really need to be curious. I'm based in the UK, and there are more and more stories that what early years staff have discovered is that dropping children at the gate in an early years setting without parents coming in seems to be more manageable for them. That is not what attachment theory would suggest. And so there's more conversation now that early years settings will retain that practice after COVID. So that's the exact opposite of what Michael is suggesting. Rather than going back to something that's healthier for children, one of the risks is that we will have discovered things that we want to keep that actually are not good for them. So staying really curious about what we know about child development is really crucial right now for the grown-ups.
Yeah, I think, and the threads that are coming through, obviously there are things that we are going to have to make an effort to unteach that have been taught with the best will in the world, like the kind of hand washing cleanliness, because children will obviously carry that with them because that's their experience of the world. But also what's kind of coming through for me in terms of classroom practice or early years setting practice is this idea of trying to step away from the very rigid, maybe topic-based, theme-based teaching where everything fits really nicely into a themed box around autumn or spring or fairy tales, whatever it may be, and allow children opportunity just to engage in more free play, interaction with each other, opportunities for them to breathe in terms of their learning, and create some gaps for a bit of growth to happen. Because often, as Eric was saying, there's very little gaps in a early childhood setting day. They can often be very timetabled, and children just move from one moment to the next. And actually, it's in the space that we will have most opportunity as practitioners to get in with children and do some real play-based work to try and give them any skills that they might well be lacking, including things like resilience, curiosity, and that kind of self-regulation, the ability to do things like follow instructions or do that serve and return where there can be the speaker or the listener. And again, there's lots of game and play-based things that you can do that would really, I don't know if anybody's got any examples off the top of their head, but things that you can do in a classroom space that really encourage that development from children.
Maybe I could take a stab at that. I think absolutely there are things we can do in an early years setting. I do think that practitioners and parents need to become more comfortable with challenging their own assumptions. One assumption that I find in many classrooms is that parents want children to bring things home, to put on the refrigerator, or they want to see sort of a product that is evidence of learning. I think another assumption among practitioners is that everyone has to have the same experience, or that community is defined by sitting in a circle. Well, it's hard to do that at the very beginning of a day with 4-year-olds. And so then practitioners are forced to adopt practices. I mean, I see in American preschools, teachers tell children to sit with their arms crossed like this. I've heard teachers say, catch a bubble in your mouth, which I think means sort of, don't talk. Pretend your toes are marshmallows. These are control devices that would not be as necessary if we actually responded to the rhythms of childhood. So I think there are a lot of things that we can do quite easily. The classic one is open-ended play, open-ended toys, blocks instead of a one outcome kind of toy. But we need to educate practitioners and parents to understand that their own tolerance for being challenged, needs to be improved. And we need to sort of rethink. There are certainly obstacles in the early years environment. There are policies and practices that teachers have no control over. But I also think there's sort of an attitudinal approach that might need rethinking.
Can I jump in on that just in response? Erica, it's so lovely to hear that sense of openness to play, and my own work sort of echoes that. Though I do have a little bit of a little caveat to that, in that we're discovering a little bit of what I'm going to call a differential impact. That depending on the profile of the child, the genetic background, the life experience, it's been a little bit more of a bouncing ball game, like sort of a ping pong game with the child, to sort of say, okay, how much, say, structure and imposed regulation does the child need? And we're finding that for, I think, children that are coming out of more chaotic environments where there was almost no structure, that a more almost like a little bit more imposed structure in the classroom creates a sense of security for a child that doesn't have that. For a child coming out of a more, typical, stable bedtimes, routines, books before bed, meal times, kind of home, whatever, wealthier class bias you want to put into that, the child kind of enters the little bit more of the free play environment. But I'm seeing, when we study resilience, we often see kids who are even more stressed, really stressed environments, seem to respond a little bit better to an environment where there's actually a little bit more structure and predictability in the school, because it makes them feel safe. So I guess what I'm trying to do is open up our toolbox a little bit, so that we're responding to individual psychological profiles, and that's tough for early educators to know when to be too much one way or the other.
Could I just respond really quickly? I promise I'll be quick. I totally agree with you. And having in my own family people with different profiles and different needs, I totally understand that. I guess I would just caution, I don't think structure necessarily means control. I think you can create a highly structured, predictable early years environment in which children have freedom to make choices and freedom to say no to things that make them feel unsafe, freedom to articulate however they do through their body language or their words what they need. So that's the only caveat. Now it's tricky to do that, but it's not impossible with the right scaffolding for the teacher as well as the child. But anyway, so I don't really think we need to frame it as either that structure means having children sit like this. And I'm sure you don't mean that either. So,
no, not that extreme,
yeah,
but more
I just
that
wanted to.
The fluidity of responding to children with different profiles of trauma and excessive parenting. And we do need a little bit more of a flexible models for these kids.
For example, you could have, a typical scenario in many preschools that I'm familiar with is that there's a morning meeting and there's an idea that you have to start the day with everyone sitting in a circle. And it's thought to be predictable and structured. But actually for children with trauma or children who are dysregulated for whatever reason, in some ways they don't need that type of predictable environment. They might need a very targeted, structured check-in with an adult, and they might be led very carefully, without a lot of stimuli, to a specific activity that they do, quietly in a corner. So that's sort of what I'm talking about, that I think predictability and structure is very important. And I think, unfortunately, many people sort of conflate structure with a kind of, I call it pseudo-academic approach. But structure can be very play-based, and it can be very—
And play becomes— and then play doesn't become what you just described. Play just becomes, let the child just kind of find their way in this room, and that openness almost freaks the child out with past trauma, because no one is guiding them to say, let's create a you yesterday. Every day you come in, you're going to go and, we're going to create what's good for you in terms of a structure. So yeah, it's a heck of a challenge for an educator to find that lovely balance between matching the needs of an individual child and running a classroom for potentially 20 other children at the same time. I certainly empathize.
You're right in that. And I think that's what the joy of being an early educator is. It's about finding that rhythm, as Eric talked about, and it's the uniqueness of individual children and trying to have a best fit model where your day has got predictability in it and more routine for those children that need it, but space for those children that might not. But again, I think a lot of the things we're talking about here are not necessarily post-pandemic issues. There are issues that have threaded their way through early childhood education strategies the world over for a long time. Is there anything that that's coming through in terms of early research about anything more concrete about how the pandemic is actually affecting children who are coming into our settings post-pandemic?
There is one really good study that came out in the journal Child Development. It's a study from Uruguay, and it's a really great study because these research team in Uruguay were already looking at school readiness in cohorts of Uruguayan children for several years. And then the pandemic happened and lockdown happened. So it wasn't a study that was specifically responding to lockdown, but lockdown has created a natural experiment because they have a cohort of Uruguayan children who went up to school pre-pandemic, and they have another cohort of children who went up post-pandemic. And they've been able to look at school readiness in those two large national cohorts, so very representative. And they're able to discern quite a lot of detectable differences between those two cohorts of children in terms of school readiness. So, as you might expect, quite a lot of impact on cognitive ability, but also surprisingly, a lot of impact on motor skills post-pandemic. So, pandemic's really impacted on children's motor skills. So we may have spent a whole year telling children not to touch it, but actually post-pandemic, these children may not even have the skills to be able to touch it, because it seems that the isolation and the lack of peer relationships, perhaps the lack of play with other children, has really impacted on their motor skills. And we're going to need to think about how educators are able to perhaps help train motor skills more formally in early years to try and compensate for some of the impact of the pandemic on motor skill development.
And of course, the good news story of that, the other flip side of that, just to give people a little hope. I mean, we know from studies of the Romanian orphans that were left in their cribs for years or months and years, the studies that were done post that situation. And I know my colleagues are familiar with all those studies, but children respond. The good news story of resilience, of course, is that children respond to adapted environments which facilitate growth and development. When we come back to this idea of Vygotsky and sort of scaffolding, when we create environments with the children being encouraged to go out and touch, and new play regimes, classrooms that are facilitative of the kinds of kids that are going to arrive there a few years from now, the good news story is that children actually respond. And in fact, I think if I can take a lesson from the Romanian kids, was that the children who had the most deprivation, the most challenges, they were the ones that responded the most and gained the most through our interventions to help them grow back onto a normative pathway, whatever that was for that particular child.
I think also it's the power of the play model, and that really appeals to where children are in terms of their cognitive and physical development. And again, in terms of gross motor, fine motor, there's all sorts of things you can do in creating an environment that really involves children in that gross motor navigation of the space, the fine motor interaction with resources that can really help to kind of rehearse and hone that development.
Alistair, I find myself these days talking about a V and using this hand motion. For a number of young children, their lives changed positively. So they woke up in the morning without stressed parents who were trying to get them off to early years while the parents went off to work. They had a garden, a yard in which to play. So for many children, their time with their adults may have, had a positive trajectory that they wouldn't have had otherwise. If we think about the stress that parents experienced, and we understand that children are changed by the interactions that they have with their parents. If their parents were stressed, then that's a different trajectory. And so there's both a positive message in that, but we need to not get so caught up in the positive message that we go, oh, whoosh, that's okay. Well, there'll be some kids who've had a more negative trajectory, if we want to put it that way, a more stressed trajectory. We need to think about both and to factor that into the sense that we are making of children's capacities and behavior and development.
I think that differential clearly predated the pandemic.
Absolutely.
And in a way, my concern, I echo everything that everyone's saying here, but my concern is that we'll sort of think that we've wrapped up the pandemic.
Yes.
And act as if there aren't these incredibly varying outcomes. And there's more and more evidence now that even small doses of trauma can be really harmful. Now, small doses of stress, sort of the right kind of stress, can help grow the brain. So it's sort of a complicated story. But, we talk about adverse childhood experiences. In the United States, 10% of children have had 3 or more of these very significant adverse childhood experiences, which affect learning. And so I do worry a little bit that if we focus, as we all tend to, we like to sort of categorize things and create stories that are very, simplistic. And so the story is the pandemic has done all these terrible things. Well, now the pandemic, when it winds down, we can just sort of move on.
I know certainly as we begin to better understand resilience, we're talking about much more multiple systems, whether this is Ann Maston's work in the US or other folks around the globe, where we're beginning to sort of think about, well, a healthy parent, of course, is going to influence. A parent that's a little more calm is going to have a better influence on a child, as is a teacher that's well-resourced in a school environment that is safe. All of these are going to create a cascade of positive impacts. In fact, and I'm in my work said we're going up to macroeconomic factors, and world commodity prices actually have a trickle down effect on the way families are stressed, which of course has an impact on whether or not a child is stressed and whether or not that child is going to be school ready. So what I'm really excited about is that we're beginning to sew this conversation together, and that poverty is not benign, or the pandemic is going to have a ripple effect. And we know that from other studies longitudinal studies like the Big Candle study in the United States, which looks at children in incredible poverty in Tennessee, or Suzanne King's work with parents who were pregnant, women who were pregnant and their children after the ice storms in Quebec, Canada, which they followed these children well as they sort of entered school years later. And over, the story is one of sort of great negatives that, that stress gets under the skin of parents, that transfers into the child, that shows up in the classrooms when those children hit preschool. But there's another story too, which is incredible capacities of those systems. Grandparents who step in. When you work around the world, of course, you see other family systems. It's not just mom and dad or whatever, the mom and mom or dad and dad. It's, we really have just so many other resources, and that those systems can have this huge differential impact depending on the profile of the child, which is a really sort of, there's a good news story here as well, potentially from this all.
I think what we're really saying is it's very complex, because obviously the adults that we're talking to are the early years practitioners. They bring their biography to their workplace as well, and they will have had their own experiences of being a child in education, as well as COVID, pandemic trauma and stress, or pre-COVID. So it's not as simple as saying early years practitioners, you can wave a magic wand and make it all better for these children. But I really do get the point that we've also got to be realistic about the fact that there will be, for some children, some biological change that will have occurred because of what they went through during the pandemic. But what we are trying to do is highlight that conversation to make everybody more aware. And it's what I think we've got to be careful is doesn't become a blame culture about whose fault it is or isn't. It's not about fault or blame. It's about the reality of the situation we find ourselves in. So that the way that we as adults cope with our stress and how our children are affected by that is a very complex thing to unpick. But what we can say as early years practitioners is if we can be more alert and aware to what we think is potentially going to walk through our door and create an environment where child development is at the center of that, and we are looking at children in terms of their development as opposed to their expectation of typical for their age and stage, then if we can create a space or an environment that supports that, which sounds really simple but isn't, then we have got the potential to make things significantly better and also change the culture of early childhood education. So even though the pandemic has been a negative in that respect, it's forcing us to maybe change what should have been changed 20, 30 years before the pandemic hit.
Alistair, do you know how I try to do that with my audiences? I show them the cover of Erica's book. And then I go, Erica, you probably don't know that. But so what I do is I show them the cover of Erica's book, which has a very scary title, right? That we're what children really need. Really, that word really is very powerful. And then I quote from one of the reviews of Erica's book that says she's arguing that we often we neglect what children can and can't do. And then I leave a little pause while the audience stops breathing, while they all consider whether that's them. And then I kind of play that up and I will say, is she allowed to say that? Has she overstated? Maybe she's overstated, it's just an opinion. Maybe she's overstated so much she should not be allowed to say that. And then I go, or what if she's right? And so what I've tried to do is I've tried to use their anxiety to move them into a place of curiosity while I hold them and I play with it a bit and I tease a bit, while I move them into asking questions. Are there things that my children are doing that I've overlooked, without any blame and without any shame? And we're saying, well, here's this woman named Erica Kostakis who thinks we might be. And if you can move people into a place of curiosity without making them feel bad about it, then we start to examine the kinds of questions that we're all talking about here with enthusiasm. And in fact, they start to recognize, yeah, there might be things that we have missed. And I have been doing that since before the pandemic.
Yeah.
So we need to find ways to keep us curious, not just give people information about child development. We need to find ways to engage with what that feels like.
Maybe I could quickly respond. And first of all, I'm quite overwhelmed by your enthusiasm for my work. If you talk to my 4 children who range in age from 12 to 30, they would, I think, strongly dispute a lot of what you're saying about me. But anyway, thank you. I've worked a lot with children in trauma, recovering from trauma. And I use a framework that is beautifully simple. It's called PACE. It's an acronym, PACE. And it stands for playfulness, acceptance, curiosity, and empathy. That's been enormously powerful for me as a parent and as an educator to sort of keep me grounded, that I don't need to solve problems for children if I can't. I don't need to reassure them because that's so rarely helpful. Reassurance is sort of a cognitive task. Persuasion, most people are not very persuadable. But if you join people emotionally with playfulness and acceptance and curiosity and empathy, that can be enormously helpful. And I think it's freeing to practitioners and to parents, because it sort of says, look, we can't build Rome in a day. We can't solve all of these stresses and problems. But if you approach the child in your care with those 4 attributes, you're going to make some progress. It's going to be better than it was before you did that.
If I might, I've been working with school boards where we've actually been brainstorming. Just Erica, that's such a lovely list, and I've heard that list before, and it's just such a lovely grounding, guiding set of principles. And then what I've been finding with working with early childhood educators and school boards is then that getting into that just brainstorming ways of modifying the classroom and the interactions between teachers or the interactions between educators and their children. Really small things like having someone greet every child as they come off the bus. I'm thinking more of an elementary school, like a kindergarten, grade 1, perhaps, but or small efforts to modify the shape of the classroom, the textures in the classroom, the small efforts to how kids are positioned and what kind of relational spaces are encouraged. Or when a child wants to self-regulate and take a time out, is there a corner that the child can move to? Can the child hear adequately? So attention, ways that the child's attention can be grabbed. Just contribution. Bruce Ellis's work in the US and others have talked about this need for children to feel like they're making a genuine contribution to the welfare of others within those spaces, or indeed just feeling that their rights are respected, that we often forget that, even a 3-year-old has that experience of whether or not they're being treated fairly within an age appropriate way. No, they can't make every decision for themselves. But one does find that when I go through sort of a checklist of saying, how can we take these principles and I've seen literally schools put up sheets of paper in the staff room that said, we're going to brainstorm out how to actually modify our daily practices with our kids so that they get some routines, they get some better relationships, they get some of their rights respected, and other things that I've written about in some of the works that I've been publishing. And it's had a profound effect of just saying, we can actually do this. This is within our control as educators. It's not just some big esoteric academic theory out there.
I think the curiosity thread is a fascinating one. And to remain curious as an educator and constantly challenge your own work and your own kind of assumptions. And the idea that for our very youngest children, they're often very powerless in their day-to-day existence. Adults make loads of decisions about when you're going to get up, what you're going to eat, what you're going to wear, what time you're going to leave. And when you get to your kind of early years space, where you're going to sit, who you're going to sit next to in your circle time, what activity you're going to do next. So that idea of giving them more opportunity to have some ownership and respecting their rights as humans is a really interesting and probably challenging one for a lot of people. David, I was just really interested thinking about the concept of school readiness, which you've talked about. It's a phrase that's often used, and I think it's has multiple interpretations. When you're talking about this idea of, in the research you were talking about people looking at school readiness, what sort of things were they considering to, the children had to have to be ready for school?
So they were thinking about, have children reached key developmental milestones that are expected of them in school? I think I agree with you. School readiness is a bizarre concept because it's socially constructed, isn't it? It's constructed by the school. You're school ready when you are able to do all the things that the school expect of you when you arrive at school. And that differs across countries and from school to school. But certainly in the UK, there's an expectation that you should have an attention span of about 10 minutes, be able to listen to a story, be able to sit on the carpet, be able to hold a pencil. And lots of children aren't able to do that when they arrive into foundation phase in the UK. And I think post-pandemic, certainly on the basis of the small number of high quality studies that have come out so far, it suggests that children are going to be deficient in a lot of those executive skills that underpin schools' expectations. So I think schools are going to have to change their expectations. That's how you make children more school ready, by getting schools to change what their expectations are of them. But also I think schools are going to have to accept that they may have to weave into the school day a bit more practice of those key skills. And it's, as we've said before, it's, children are very plastic and they can catch up really quickly, but they're only going to do that with the right response from practitioners. And a lot of what is needed is really around executive functioning. So it's about inhibitory control, working memory, planning, motor coordination. And all of these things are really, hugely variable in children when they go to school anyway. There's a lot of individual difference. But a lot of those skills, because of the experience of lockdown and the way that families are operating post-lockdown, a lot of these children are going to be not as good at those skills as they should have been before lockdown. And so we'll want practitioners to think about really simple things that they can do during the school day to maybe practice some of those skills. So a really good example of that is around inhibitory control. So you can practice inhibitory control in children in really fun ways, really easily. Playing Simon Says. We say, Simon says, put your hands on your head. Simon says, put your hands on your shoulders, touch your nose. That practices inhibitory control because you have to follow the rule. And if you don't follow the rule, you're kind of out. And teachers can do that. They can play Simon Says for a couple of minutes every day as a warm-up before a lesson. Skipping is also a really great way of practicing inhibitory control and also planning, because you've really got to anticipate when you're going to jump in. And again, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that you can push the desks aside for a couple of minutes, give all the children a skipping rope, do a couple of minutes of skipping. And so they're really two examples of things that teachers can do really quickly and easily. It doesn't impact on their planning. And there are also strategies that can be shared with parents. Yeah. So parents can be said, actually, play Simon Says, get a skipping rope, practice these things to help your child in school. And they can equally do lots of other strategies that would practice aspects of, say, working memory. So there are games like I Went to Market, where you go to the shop and you buy something and you have to remember an increasingly long list of things. I'm very bad at that game, but it practices working memory because you've got to remember everything. Yeah. And teachers can play this in school, but going back to Michael's earlier point about teachable moments, you can play that with your child in the car. You don't need to pay attention to do it. You can play I Went to Market on the school run, and you're practicing auditory working memory, and you're helping compensate for an aspect of development that may have been differentially impacted by lockdown, and helping get your child a little more ready for their educational journey.
And I think those things can't hurt either. So for children who didn't have that kind of experience and aren't experiencing that kind of difference, though they're still great games to play. And thinking about Erica's point earlier about the kind of often we will bring children together and we meet in a circle, and we see that as being an important meeting time. And sometimes you have to go through the pain of news where maybe 30 children might share a piece of news, one after the other. And again, that works on your inhibitory control, because it's really hard not to just either shout out or fall asleep or say you need to go to the toilet. But those things also for children in terms of their emotional connection with the space, if you're sitting there thinking, my bum's getting numb, I'm bored, when's it my turn? Or I've had my turn, I've lost interest now, then that's not the positive impact that maybe a game like Simon Says or skipping could have, where you've got high levels of engagement and children are really buying into the process. And it's almost, learning by default. Whereas some of the routines that maybe we use regularly in your classroom, we just need to look back on and reflect on and just question, as Suzanne was saying, be curious, but curious in a way that says, does this really have a positive impact on all of my children? Or is it just something that I've always done and maybe I need to do it differently?
I think that absolutely all of these little suggestions I've just made, they're fun and they're simple. I also think it's worth reminding our viewers that, to my knowledge, in terms of neuroscience, there is no upper limit to executive function. So even if children are actually quite good at planning or have quite good working memory, practicing those will just further enhance that skill, so that we'll get even better at remembering or even better at planning. So we mustn't think, oh, we have to maybe play all of these games because a third of the class seem to be deficient in terms of inhibitory control. There's no upper limit to these things. So all children will benefit, but more importantly, perhaps children most at risk will benefit the most.
This inhibitory control and these executive function skills are sometimes viewed by parents and teachers as sort of, yeah, I know that's really important, but I really want to make sure my children learn to read. So I would just like to add, as someone who is actually a reading I work with dyslexic students and I'm very interested in early language. There's a very strong relationship between executive function and language skills, and particularly reading, which requires an enormous amount of capacity for working memory and all of these other things. So I think, the more that we can explain the importance of things like playing Simon Says, and Alistair, to your point, I think that a lot of times in classrooms that I've observed and taught in myself, we aren't really attuned to the kind of cognitive load that we place on children. And so if you're, as you put it, sitting on your bum, trying to figure out when you can speak, you're probably not really listening to what's being said. And I think oftentimes early years teachers kind of go through this question and response thing where they ask what I call checking questions, where the answer to the question is not actually very important. So you might read a story and say, now, how many bananas are here? Or what's the color of the kitten in the tree? And, those kinds of things, they may be supporting some kind of self-control, but they're actually sort of dumb and a waste of time. So I think it's really incumbent on researchers to help teachers and parents understand, what these sort of play-based opportunities are to build executive function. And I know there are lists all over the place and there are lots of resources, but I think we need to empower people to see what is worth doing and what isn't.
Yeah, and just keep that on practitioners' agenda. And I think also there's a real strong thread here about parents, the fact that a lot of the things we've talked about are practical, they are game-based, they might have quite fancy titles that are alien to some parents, but actually very explainable in terms of things like executive function. So we can actually provide parents with a lot of information that they can use to support their children's development through play. So it doesn't have to be sitting at the kitchen table doing various worksheets that will really have a positive impact. So getting together collections of resources and putting them in places where parents can access them and understand them would be a really useful support to practitioners who are in the classroom space.
Absolutely. And I mean, things like jigsaws and Lego are the perfect examples of where, most parents have them at home, children like them, they're fun, and the way that parents and teachers can maximize children's learning from those sorts of games is back to scaffolding, giving the child just the right amount of sensitive interaction and support when they need it so that they can carry on exploring and learning on their own, but with the right interaction from a parent or a teacher.
So this very sensitive scaffolding that we have to do, sometimes you over scaffold, sometimes you under scaffold, and sometimes you just get it completely wrong. But it's the fact that if you're trying to tune in all the time to where your child is at, you're more likely to get it right more times than you don't.
Our conversation has taken us very much to sort of toddlers and above. So we started to talk about school and early years. I just want to stress that all of this applies also to babies, and in fact, babies who were developing in the womb. So the pandemic will have had an impact, and in a way that sometimes we think, well, they were too young to remember that. Brains are developing really rapidly in babyhood. Babies are picking up on stressed parents. And so I just want to throw in a word about the babies and the babies in the womb when we think about where this period is going to have an impact on the development of our children and what schools and early years settings are going to meet as children come back into those spaces.
Well, Suzanne, I think you're echoing something exactly what we're understanding is that there's, that on the negative side of that is we can expect a flood of conduct disorder challenges in 4-year-olds in about 4 years. We know that based on every other longitudinal study that's occurred. But we also know that good government interventions, good early childhood supports, all those investments we're making in the billions of dollars across at least many countries across the West will actually mitigate that impact and make it a much smoother transition. So we won't be seeing this spike in conduct disorders and anxiety disorders as children enter our schools. The only other thing I wanted to add, the other part of that is because we're doing efforts like this to reach out to parents. I mean, we're giving them good information. And if I might, the one thing because I tend to work in a lot of very impoverished refugee populations, other contexts around the globe, throughout sub-Saharan Africa, whatever, where, there might not be, say, a puzzle or something like that. But what I certainly see, including here in my own country of Canada, is the simple use of chores, the everyday tasks of the child standing up on the stool while the parent is baking and stacking the serving cups from small to large, or the forming the cookie dough, the carrying the plates, the putting stuff away, the small tasks of stacking things, or pushing a broom. I think sometimes we forget that most cultures around the world don't have formal play; they have work, and that our chore-based tasks for children are their work. They can actually pick up a lot of these skills, and that even a very disadvantaged environment can still create the opportunities for children to thrive through the natural moments in a child's life.
And that's where I think of course that's the Montessori ethos, that work is play. And the other thing I would like to bring up, which I'm not sure we've really touched on explicitly, is the role of nature in healing children and helping them grow. I think conversely, I think we would be remiss if we didn't mention screen time. And I think it's important to be nuanced about this. There are many positive uses of screen time. I mean, right now we're having this wonderful conversation that would not be possible were we not using a screen. But I do worry about the increasing tendency among certain types of families, certainly in the more developed world, of plugging babies into iPads, in all kinds of settings when they go out to dinner, and parents need a break. And we've always had playpens, and we've always had ways to tune kids out when we need time to ourselves to work or to recharge. But I think we do need to talk about that as well, that there really is evidence that this sort of distracted parenting where you're kind of hovering around but not fully attuned can be quite dangerous. And I think that, I guess to sort of summarize, I think parents need to be forgiven for relying on tools to give themselves a break. But when they are with their children, I think it's really important that we help them to understand the importance of being tuned in. So I guess I would say, smaller doses of truly engaged parenting is a good thing. Yeah.
I would agree with that, Erica. And I think we also want to try and help parents to rediscover the joy of simple play with their children, and to give them suggestions and encouragement for for games that are easy to play, that don't have a lot of setup time, don't have a lot of complicated rules, and games that we know will, for the most part, be successful and rewarding for both parent and child, to encourage them to continue extending in their play. Because again, if parents are going to be relying on, buying board games, they're relying on buying one that they think their child is going to be able to play and is developmentally suitable, and that's quite difficult. So very simple games, or just interactions. In some ways, I think actually just, the nice thing about playing a simple game is the parent and child are sat opposite each other at the kitchen table, and it's a natural environment in which parents and children can share. So maybe the child will share something about what happened at school that day that otherwise they wouldn't have mentioned, because they weren't in that same setting of sitting opposite a parent. They might disclose that friendship has gone wrong or something else, and they wouldn't naturally otherwise have done that. And so that does help to influence and shape parent-child relationships in the way that an iPad or iPhone just simply can never do that.
Absolutely. And I think it's really important that we talk to parents about the idea of activities and interactions, and not just always activities, because an interaction can be way more powerful. And I love the idea that Michael's talking about as well, just reinforming parents that life, day-to-day life, if you involve children in the appropriate aspects of adults' day-to-day life, the cooking, the cleaning, the talking, the errands, all of those things really work on that core development of what it is to be a successful human being. Unbelievably, we are now at the very end of our time. But before we go, we've covered so much ground, and literally I would happily sit here for another 3 hours and just chat to you all. It's great. Is there one takeaway in any aspect of anything we've discussed? The one point that, if you could only make one point, that you would like just to reinforce from kind of what you've said today, that you really think would be important for parents and practitioners to take away? Suzanne, can we start with you?
I would like to stress the importance of laughter. The more laughter you have, a whole lot of stuff is happening underneath that laughter. And we've used the word complex quite a bit today, and that can feel scary to people. Yeah. So if there's one thing that I would encourage in recovering from the pandemic and before the pandemic and just in life, it's laugh as much as you can and notice the times that you do. It really matters. It's not light and silly. Lots of stuff that's important.
And young children are really usually very good for making you laugh. That's one thing they are very good for. Erica.
I think I would say we need to remain open. If we open up children's schedules, if we open up how we listen to them, if we use open-ended conversational techniques, instead of making a comment about a child's drawing in a specific way, if we say, tell me about your drawing, I just think this openness in the way we talk and respond to children is very helpful for everybody.
Yeah, I was just talking about that yesterday, about saying to a parent, at the end of the day, don't say to your child, what did you do today? Or who did you play with today? Give them a bit of breathing space, because their brains will be full. And it's sometime later, maybe over tea, maybe at bedtime, maybe in the bath. Maybe say something like, what was the best bit of your day? Which leaves them the opportunity to explore their thinking. And even just that simple rephrasing of the question can open up loads of opportunity. So that's excellent advice. David.
I think I'd like to highlight the fact that for both teachers and parents, it's very easy to weave fun ways of practicing executive functioning into home and school life, and not to be intimidated by that, but to embrace it.
And revisit some of those games that you played when you were little and you didn't have an iPad, and exactly. you may well have forgotten about. And last but not least, Michael.
I just like to say that I'm an optimist about, though the pandemic has left its scars potentially, but I also think we're like domino blocks. The healthier the systems around a child, whether that's parents and schools and early educators and extended families and communities and even governments, as we tip one of those over, they tend to create a cascade of positive effects across those others, right down to the child. And everything we're talking about, every little effort will have a ripple effect through a child's life and can really change their trajectory. So parents matter. Early childhood educators certainly matter as well.
Yeah. And I think it's remembering that we are all ultimately connected. And also for us as early childhood educators, the world is becoming a smaller and smaller place. And there are opportunities like this and the internet where you can reach out and connect with people that you never could have done 10, 20 years ago, that have got amazing things to help you to be curious about your practice, which I think has been the real thread that's come out for me today, that, you know, what we're talking about isn't just a symptom of the pandemic. It's often practice around early childhood development that probably needed a refocus. But as long as we remain curious and informed, there is lots of information out there that can really help us to help children to reach their full potential. So thank you so much for joining us for this TDS event, Little Lockdowners. We know this is a sensitive subject for some, but I hope that you found the discussion to be both interesting and encouraging. And I think as a practitioner, the key takeout for me was that whilst the pandemic has undoubtedly had a profound effect on many children, there are loads of opportunities for us together to change their future for the better. So a big thank you to Erica Christakis, Professor David Daly, Dr. Suzanne Zadaik, and Michael Ungar for your really valuable insight and advice. If you'd like to watch the webinar again, revisit certain parts, or even share it with friends and colleagues, you can do that by going to the TTS World of Education website, which is just worldofeducation.tts-group.co.uk. I know there is so much more to understand on this topic, so TTS are working with other experts from around the globe to bring you new ideas and resources for supporting your children in your early years setting. And we'll also be answering the questions that you've been posting throughout this webinar. And plus, you can look out for some exciting follow-up content from our fantastic panelists that's coming really soon. You'll also find all of this on the World of Education. So thanks for watching. And if you'd like to share your own experience or give us your feedback, then please get in touch through the TTS social channels. Thanks a lot. Bye.